Seems like everywhere we turn, Black women are being told explicitly or implicitly that we aren't good enough. We're too loud, we're too angry, we're ugly. All this while being compared to people and women of other races who have privileges and advantages over us. And if we point this out or we say something, we are oftentimes gaslit and told that we are bitter and to stop complaining and just to love ourselves. I'm making this video series, Black Women and Self-Love, because I want to validate you. I see you, sis. And my hope is that after watching this video, you will know and understand that there's nothing wrong with you if you are struggling with self-esteem, self-love, and struggling to love yourself as a Black woman. So I want you to grab a cup of tea or whatever drink of choice feels right for you, and let's have a conversation. Hi, I'm Dr. Shanice Jones-Cameron, and I am a communication professor and founder of Her Guided Evolution, a digital platform dedicated to helping Black women prioritize self-care and personal growth. So in today's video, I want to talk about why a lot of Black women struggle with self-love. And I really want to validate you if you are a Black woman who is or has in the past struggled with self-esteem, self-love, self-worth, all of those things. I just want to validate you and say that it makes sense. And one of the reasons why I feel the need to make a video like this and to really validate Black women who may be struggling with self-love is because I think that a lot of Black women may struggle with self-love, and I think that we are oftentimes collectively gaslit. And I know gaslighting is a term that all over the internet, it's kind of like used incorrectly. It's kind of thrown in conversations, and a lot of people use it and may not be using it correctly. So I just wanted to read the definition of gaslighting according to my good sis Merriam-Webster. And gaslighting is, quote, psychological manipulation of a person, usually over an extended period of time, that causes the victim to question the validity of their own thoughts, perception of reality, or memories, and typically leads to confusion, loss of confidence and self-esteem, uncertainty of one's emotional or mental stability, and a dependency on the perpetrator. So that's straight from Merriam-Webster. And I say that I think the Black women that oftentimes we are collectively gaslit because as women in a patriarchal society, particularly as Black women, of course, that's who I'm speaking to directly, but as women in a patriarchal society, meaning social hierarchies where men are at the top and everyone who is not a man is toward the bottom. As women in a patriarchal society, our worth and our value is often placed on what we look like. And in our context in the United States, in a Western society, history of colonization, the preferred aesthetic and the preferred phenotype is going to be someone who is often white, thin, has straight hair, finer and smaller features. So Black women are oftentimes juxtaposed against that aesthetic. So the messaging that we receive from a very young age, the television that we watch, the films that we see are mostly communicating the standard and this idea of beauty. And for a group of people, women, particularly Black women, whose value is often placed on what they look like, it would make sense that we would have issues with this aesthetic and placing ourselves within this world. And it's like oftentimes people want to gaslight Black women, and that's why I use that term gaslighting, because people want to oftentimes drag Black women for wearing weaves, straightening their hair, trying to wear different color contacts in some cases, for trying to fit this European aesthetic, or assimilate is what it is, which is trying to take on characteristics of the dominant society in order to gain acceptance and privileges. Oftentimes, people want to gaslight Black women and drag Black women for trying to take on this aesthetic, while simultaneously having no smoke whatsoever for the cultural ideas that we are constantly put up against and judged according to these standards. And I think a lot of us come to the conclusion that Black women, or ourselves as Black little girls, as many of us are younger, when we start noticing these patterns, we start noticing them pretty young. You can see this trope in television and film, for example, where you'll see like the Black woman or the Black girl being the sidekick to the main character who is more important, or positioned as more important. I think about just myself growing up in the 90s, in the early 2000s, but I used to love the movie Clueless. And of course, in the movie Clueless, Cher is the blonde white woman who's the main character, and Dion is Cher's like best friend and sidekick. And Dion is like the side character where you don't really get to know much about her or her family. Most of the emphasis is on Cher and what Cher is experiencing and navigating. And so that's just one example of one of the ways that I think about through television and film and popular culture, we are often positioned as an accessory or the sidekick to the more important character. One of the saddest things that I have kind of realized as a parent and as a mom is that I knew this, of course, but just seeing definitive evidence that I cannot protect my children from anti-Blackness. And I have two daughters. I have 5-year-old twins and a 7-year-old daughter, but all of them are now in school. They're in elementary school. And one day I was doing my youngest daughter's hair, and I was asking her, like, so do you want like bantu knots? Do you want braids and some beads? And just kind of asking her about all these hairstyles that I could possibly do for her hair. You know, we protect styling over here. But I remember she said, no, I want Elsa hair. And so, of course, that was just really sad to me, because that was one of those instances where I realized no matter how hard I tried to like push Black beauty and try to, you know, focus on television and film representations that look like them, they're not immune, and none of us are immune to like internalized anti-Blackness. I've even like started to wear my hair in more like natural and phenotypically Black hairstyles because they started talking about my straight hair or when I was wearing my hair straight, and I just wanted to make sure that I was kind of showing up in a way that I felt like was more affirming to their self-image. And of course, my daughters are lighter skinned, but of course, Black women, particularly those of us who are darker skinned, colorism is a very real issue. So we tend to run into even more issues, I would say, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, with self-esteem and self-worth, because we are constantly receiving images, even within our community, that we aren't as valuable, that we aren't as preferred, and we aren't as desirable. And once again, a lot of this starts when we're really young. I remember when I was in middle school and elementary school, like I used to love all the girl groups like Destiny's Child, 3LW. And I remember when 3LW's No More Baby I'ma Do Right, like when that song and that video came out in the early 2000s, I remember identifying with Naturi Naughton, who was on Power, who has now gone on to have a pretty successful like acting career, but she was a darker skinned girl in the group, so of course like that was who I identified with. But I remember watching that video and noticing and seeing like, oh, well, she doesn't really have any lead parts, and she's just kind of like in the background singing along to the chorus, and she's not like the main person in this video. And I also remember like one of my friends, or like one of the boys in the neighborhood that I was, that was like kind of part of my friend group here and there. And he said something to the effect of like, just flat out, like, light-skinned girls are prettier. And I was arguing back and forth with him. I was just like, no, that's not true. Like, there's plenty of like beautiful, like dark-skinned and darker-skinned girls. And he was like, no, light-skinned girls are prettier. We're like in middle school at the time. So, you know, let's, as much as we can, be like generous for the frame of mind that all of us were in. But he was telling me like flat out and straight in my face, like, light-skinned girls are prettier. His mom bleaches her skin. And one of the examples he used was like, no, like, look at Beyonce and Kelly. Like, Beyonce is clearly, and Beyonce and Kelly rolling from Destiny's Child, like, it's like, no, Beyonce is clearly more beautiful than Kelly Rowland. So, like, these examples of colorism, like, I just remember, you know, like, just experiencing this and receiving this messaging throughout my life. And I also remember like this time where we were at, me and my cousins and my sisters, we were at my grandma's house. And one of my cousins who didn't live in the same state was there visiting, and she was like younger than us. So I probably was like maybe 9, maybe like 8, or maybe like 7 or 8, 9, somewhere there at this time. And my little cousin, she was probably like maybe like 4 or 5. But I remember one of my like grown adult cousins, like my dad's cousin, so he was like my second cousin, and the little girl who was like my other little girl cousin was like, who was like 4 or 5. She was lighter skin, or high yellow, as colorists often say. Oh, she was high yellow with longer hair. And I just remember me and all of my other cousins, we were sitting at my grandma's kitchen table. And my grown adult cousin was asking somebody, or asking my grandma. He was like, who's that pretty little girl right there? And one of my older cousins, she was probably like, maybe like 12 or so at the time. She jokingly was like, oh, me? You know, I'm such and such's daughter, da-da-da-da. And then my adult cousin was like, he just patted her on the back. He was like, oh, no, baby, I wasn't talking about you. And all of us, like, we just started dying laughing. And because, I mean, the exchange, like, at the time, it was funny, but, like, I also realized, like, in that moment, like, that was one of those instances where I realized, like, I look more like my older cousin rather than my younger cousin who was lighter skinned with the long hair. And I just remember, like, oh, I am darker skin. I'm not, you know, one of the folks or one of the people who would stand out like my younger cousin who had like the lighter skin and the longer hair. So I'm like, so many of us like get these messages from our childhood well into our adulthood, from just people that we can interact with, as well as like the media that we consume. So that's one of the reasons why I say, like, if you are a Black woman struggling with self-esteem and self-love, like, it makes sense. Many of us have these experiences that we can look back on and remember all of the ways that we were told that we were not good enough. And that's compounded by the fact that as women, a lot of our value is placed on what we look like. And so, of course, even outside of like colorism and those experiences, just being a Black girl and a Black woman moving in the world, we come up against so much like judgment and devaluation that it would make sense that we would struggle with self-love sometimes. I remember like in eighth grade, or just kind of looking back, I've just to kind of preface this, like I have like a lot of teachers, there's several, I won't say a lot, I have several teachers that I look back on and I was just like, yeah, she was racist and she just hated me, or just like teachers that hated me for like no reason. But this one particular teacher, I remember I was in 8th grade, and in 8th grade, we had to take like EOCs, which were end of course tests. And this was my language arts class. And I remember my teacher who hated me, like she would, when I tell y'all she hated me, like she would just find ways to like drag me in front of the class, and she would say really rude things to me. Like I remember one kid like lied on me and said, Shanice said I look like such and such, even though I did not say this to him at all. And she like derided me in front of the whole class and told me to grow up and all these other things. But that's beside the point. That's not a story that I'm telling today. But I remember this one particular time we were taking end of course tests, or we had taken end of course tests, and she was like going through and she was talking about like what was the class average, and she was talking about the highest score in like the whole 8th grade, and she said this person, this white person, had the highest score in the whole 8th grade. And me, I'm sitting there looking at my paper, and I'm looking, just kind of glancing around at people around me, and I noticed like, my score is like, I don't see anybody with this score. And so somebody in my class was like, hey, Miss such and such, who got the highest score in this class? And she was like, oh, who got the highest score in this class? And she paused, and I just remember she was so reluctant, and she was like, well, Shanice got the highest score in this class. And I just remember feeling like, oh, she ain't want to say that. And I just remember at the time, I just remember kind of internalizing that as my accomplishments and what I do isn't good enough to be like recognized or put up in the forefront as something to like aspire to, because it wasn't the highest grade in the 8th grade or whatever, even though it was literally like 1 point away from like, it was like 1 or 2 points away from the highest score in the 8th grade. But you know, in retrospect, she hated me and she was racist, and that's why she didn't feel like that was something that was like worthy of pointing out, or she just didn't want to point it out for some reason. So it's the culmination of little experiences like that over and over and over again that I say, like, it's no wonder that many of us may struggle with self-love and self-worth. And of course, these are my experiences. I'm not saying like everybody has had these same experiences, or this is the one unified monolithic Black woman experience or Black child experience. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying if you are someone who has struggled with self-love and self-esteem, it makes sense, and it's probably because much of your childhood and adult life you have encountered these experiences with racism and anti-Blackness and possibly colorism that kind of normalizes Black women supposedly being less than, even though that is not true, and of course couldn't be further from the truth. And for Black women and girls, oftentimes we develop internalized misogyny and internalized misogynoir. So misogyny is the hatred and distrust of women. Misogynoir is a combination of misogyny, and noir is Black and French, which means a particular brand of misogyny that is aimed at Black women, and this distrust, demonization, policing, and control of Black women and Black women's bodies. And misogynoir is a term that was coined by Dr. Moya Bailey, who's a professor at Northwestern University, and a writer, Trudy, was instrumental in coining that term or using that term in online spaces as well. But a lot of us have a lot of internalized misogyny and misogynoir that we are kind of carrying and walking around with. And you'll see this internalized misogyny and misogynoir by the ways in which we will judge other women. So because women are placed in like lower on social hierarchies in a patriarchal society, so like men are generally have more power than women, and our value is oftentimes wrapped up in how we look, what will happen is you'll have women kind of policing other women based on these very harmful standards. So we'll see this as, this will show up as us calling other women fast, and if you grew up in the South, you know what I'm talking about, calling girls fast and saying they've slept with these many people and look at what she's wearing. She looks like an X, Y, and Z, and we're supposed to be like, you know, respectable and wearing certain things that will indicate that we respect ourselves, as like clothing is really like has anything to do with respect and value and how we actually get treated, because women can wear whatever and still be treated horribly and experience violence. But, you know, there's other, you know, internalized misogyny and trying to police women's sexuality and holding each other to these unfair standards just to kind of feel like we are better or more respectful and more worthy of male attention, because essentially in a patriarchal society, that's oftentimes what we are in pursuit of, male approval or attention. So we're also navigating this internalized misogyny where we may even be turning that against ourselves in really painful ways, and other women subjecting us to these types of ideas and judging us based on these ideas. You'll also see this like show up in very problematic ways of talking about and thinking about women's bodies. Like, for example, like vaginas are it's something that we just need to be like kind of like ick about, or saying vaginas have certain smells, and talking badly about women's like certain body parts that women have, for example. Like, these are examples of internalized misogyny and that like hatred that we are oftentimes in our society taught to have about ourselves, taught to have about other women, and just taught to kind of view women's bodies, which I think adds, of course, an additional layer to why many of us may struggle with self-love and self-worth. Now, I'm definitely personally at a point in my life where, just as a woman and as a scholar, like I just understand these things on like a deeper level and from another perspective, and understand like a lot of these ideas are cultural. They didn't come from me. They are not like the reality for me and the standard that I hold myself to or anything like that. So I have like a large degree of separation from these ideas. I struggled with self-esteem a lot more in like middle school and high school. Now in my adult life, I struggle less about what I look like and more about like my intelligence. Yes, even though I have a PhD, of course. Of course, like struggle with my intelligence and like decisions that I've made and things that I've said. Like, those are like some of the ways like in my adult life that self-love or less self-love and like me knowing that I still have work to do on my journey, that's some of the ways that it shows up for me. But I just really have kind of settled into this idea that self-love is a journey. It's a journey. And even though like most days I'm not like feeling bad about like the way I look on the outside, most days, some days I do, but most days that's not my issue and that's not my struggle. I still have my struggles, and I have my issues with confidence. And what I just keep reminding myself is that self-love is a journey. Like, no matter how much education I have, no matter how much I read about these things and lecture about these things, I am a person, I am a Black woman who is navigating an anti-Black society, in a society that's often anti-woman as well, or anti-anyone who is not male or a man identified. And so I am, to a degree, going to be a product of that culture and of that environment. So for me, it's about giving myself space to grow in my self-love. It's about giving myself the self-care that I need when I am trying to operate in this context and operate in this world that is meant to break me down as a Black woman. And so I just want to validate you once again. If you are a Black woman If you are a young Black woman especially who is struggling with self-esteem, self-love, self-worth, it makes sense based on what I am assuming have probably been some really painful experiences that you have unfairly had to navigate. We see Black women setting trends, creating aesthetics that are appropriated by non-Black women only to be praised and profited from our creativity and our ideas. We see this show up in so many facets and so many aspects of life and entertainment. And it makes sense if you are struggling with self-love and self-esteem. And I just want to say that is okay. That is okay. Self-love is a journey, and it is one that we collectively, I want to encourage us all to put more action behind. Put more action behind self-love and trying to unlearn some of these really problematic ideas that we have about ourselves, about other Black women, about women in general as well, that are keeping us in this cycle of low self-worth and weaponizing these harmful cultural ideas against ourselves. So if you are a Black woman who has struggled with self-love and self-worth, I just want to validate you. It makes sense that you may be struggling to see yourself in a positive light and to see yourself as worthy. And so I just want to validate you. At the same time, I don't want us to stay here. I want us all to continue growing on our self-love journeys and to start trying to address some of these harmful messages that we have been unfairly forced to navigate. And I think the first step is to acknowledge some of the messages that we have received that have contributed to us struggling with self-esteem and struggling with self-love. And so I really want to continue this conversation. If you feel comfortable, please leave a comment and just share what were some of the experiences that chipped away at your self-worth and your self-love, and it has kind of prompted you not to love yourself as much as you would probably like. So, as I mentioned, this video is part of my Black Women and Self-Love series. Please subscribe to the Her Guided Evolution YouTube channel so you don't miss the next video. And please like this video. And thank you so much for watching. I will catch up with you in the next video. Bye. Thank you.